Hello, I'm Derek.
And I'm Eloa, and we're here in this episode of Derek Draper's Space to talk about Chapter 5 of Create Space, Space to Share. The lesson that opens this chapter is as follows. You need to create the space to be in touch with and share what is really going on for you if you are to have real, rich relationships. And of course, the premise is that this is completely applicable at work, in corporate or in business environments. The story in this chapter is of Beata. Do you want to give us a sense, a little tidbit about that story?
Yeah. So Beata ran a team in a big global company, right? Quite complicated because she had some people working for her, other people worked with her that reported to someone else. There was other people who were regional, some global. But she ran a team that was selling spirits, right? And they weren't doing that well, right? Which surprised everyone because they were a popular team. They liked each other. Everyone thought that they would work, and they had all various kind of, the skills, their experience, the level of their intellect, the creativity was all pretty high, right? It should have worked as a team, but it wasn't working. And when I was asked to go and kind of work with the team to try and figure out why, as the story, I won't spoil the story, but the story basically is that I was flummoxed, right, for a while. I also saw this perfect team, and then I realized, well, hang on a minute, perfect? Why would it, or should it be perfect? And again, to cut a story short, the problem was that the team was too nice to each other, right? So they could only share positive things, positive news, positive ideas, positive feedback, right? And it was really holding them back because, of course, on a subterranean level, there was some negative thoughts, there was some disagreement, there was some personality conflicts, right? They were being repressed, right? Partly because of who Beata was, right? And so we worked really hard doing some of the things that we might talk about to try and get that team to kind of shift into a much more real emotional space, right? Because emotions are not just positive. Sometimes they can be negative, but the negative emotions are also important.
There's something kind of very in vogue at the moment about positive psychology, focusing on the positive, and there's lots of studies about the benefits of gratitude and people who consciously count their blessings, who are less prone to depression and do tend to be happier, although of course there are nuances to it. I think the risk is that we take that just at face value and it's a bit black and white and two-dimensional. And it sounds to me like that's what Beata's team had internalized, that there wasn't any value or any space or room for the less positive emotions that are a bit more painful and uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And
what it squeezes out, by the way, is vulnerability.
Yes.
Right. If you're only positive, if only the positive things are allowed, then you don't have that vulnerability. And vulnerability is Brené Brown is the great theorist of vulnerability, a fantastic TED talk, a great book. You have to put yourself sometimes into a place of vulnerability at work because that is the real thing, right?
There was a really interesting study done by Google. It was a multi-year study called Project Aristotle, and there's a brilliant article in the New York Times about it. And what they were doing at Google was trying to find out how to create the perfect team. So going back to that word perfect, but the most high-performing team, like what was it? They did loads of cross-sectional studies and they couldn't find any patterns. And for people working at Google to not be able to find patterns is quite a strange thing, right? So eventually they stumbled upon research about norms, about what is it that groups of people internalize as their habitual ways of being. And that led them to the studies on psychological safety, which I think really connects to this stuff about vulnerability. So you write about psychological safety in the book, which is the work of Professor Amy Edmondson. Can you connect the dots for us between, firstly, what is psychological safety, and then how does it relate to creating space to share and to teams?
Yeah. So psychological safety is the idea that within that group of people, it's okay to be wrong, be sad, be vulnerable,
Be human,
be human, right? But and actually, and be stupid, right? To say something stupid, right? To make a mistake,
to ask
right?
stupid questions,
to ask for help, right? All of those things that make us kind of, how's that going to be interpreted? What Google, with the multi-million-pound study, have proven is that actually those things don't make a worse team, right? Or look at that team sharing all their vulnerabilities and, you know, sort of allowing people to admit that they've made mistakes, right? We'd never allow that in our team, you know. Well, your team won't perform as well as that other team. Fact, right? It's been studied with huge amounts of data. It's that notion that it's safe, psychologically safe, to be yourself and to, as you say, be a human being, right? And so, you know, that's the culture that a team should be trying to create, and an organization should be trying to create, right? And if you do that, then people will share more. It has all sorts of effects, you know, things that people cover up because they don't want to admit their part in it, right? Or they don't want to spoil everyone's kind of sense that everything's going well, that can lead to catastrophic mistakes in certain and catastrophes in certain industries, you know, will be lessened if you have that notion of psychological safety. If you're allowed to be yourself, then you bring your whole self to work, right? Levels of engagement are higher. You know, that it's a sort of massive effect that this notion has, and the book goes into a bit. But as you say, people can read, you know, the article in the New York Times or Amy Edmondson's work, and really get their heads around, well, what does this mean for my team, and how can we kind of bring it into our team?
It's a favourite topic of mine. I could bang on about it all day. At CDP, the leadership consultancy that you founded that I work for, we have a team model, or a model of team dynamics, that also connects into this idea of creating space to share. Do you want to share that with us?
Yeah, so, you know, what we tried to do at CDP was in consultation with some clients who had team issues. We sort of tried to work out, well, what are the kind of key elements of a team, right? And we worked out that there were 3 Ds, right? The first is direction, right? So you have to have purpose and goals and motivation, right? The second one is delivery. So you have to actually produce stuff, right? Whatever you're supposed to produce. And that's about structure and planning and accountability, all of which are kind of very important. But the third one is D for dynamics, right? And the dynamics are the internal dynamics and the external dynamics, and then the overall culture. And what we would say is that a successful team needs to be looking at how it's working with itself on an emotional, psychological basis, right? Psychological safety, as we've discussed, would be like a key thing that you were trying to bring into that. But also, how are you dealing with external relationships or connections, right? What are you willing to share externally, right? And again, are you going to make yourself vulnerable, right? Are you going to go to a client and say, well, actually, we're not that good at that, so maybe you should go elsewhere, you know, turning business down because it's not really the best thing, right? You know, so again, anathema to lots of business people, but actually the way to build trust, you know, trust is at the heart of this, right? You know, and you know, the mistake that people make without thinking about it is to think that if you're honest and open and yourself, then you will create issues of trust, right? Because if you tell me that sometimes you can't do things or don't do things, right, how am I going to trust you? But actually, if you tell me something I already know because I see it, I'm going to trust you. And when you say I'm going to do that, or I can't do that because, I'm going to believe you, right? Because we've established trust.
I think it's at this point in the book where when I was reading it, I started to really see the dots all joining, because what you're saying there goes back to, for me, to Reku with the rushing, which we talk about in the chapter and the episode on creating space to reflect. Rushing and rushing, trying to be a yes person, trying to always deliver. And actually taking that space to reflect and be honest with yourself, and then check in with what you're feeling. Oh God, I'm feeling really overwhelmed and stressed. I'm dancing on the edge of burnout here. And then taking that to your colleague, your line manager, your direct reports, and actually being honest. That's actually what builds trust.
And also, of course, you know, our view as psychodynamic psychologists would be that these emotions, these issues, they don't disappear just because you repress them, either yourself or in an organization or in a team, right? What happens is, if you try and not have them in the picture, right, if you squeeze them out, bang, stress, bang, massive people being ill, signed off work, right? Bang, very low levels of well-being and therefore engagement, right? Bang, people being basically miserable at work, right? So they don't disappear. It's not like you say, oh, we don't have emotions here. Well, you do. Where are they? Where are they? And how are they then affecting the work, right? So it's all about being open and honest enough to say that emotions matter and we can kind of handle them here. In this workplace, in this team, in this organization, we kind of accept that emotions are there and we're going to kind of talk about them.
And speaking of which, that takes us to something else I want to cover, which is the idea of challenging conversations.
Yeah.
And as part of that, listening.
Yeah.
It's really easy to think that we all know how to listen. I'm a great listener. It's really easy to kind of claim that about yourself. But in the book, you cover the coactive model of listening, which has got 3 levels.
That's right.
So I might say what I think they are, and then you can sort of. So the first level of listening is really about paying attention to yourself. In a sense, it's quite negative. It's quite good because you're kind of reflecting and checking in with what you are feeling or thinking, but it shuts the other person out. It's that kind of, oh, what am I going to have for dinner when I get home tonight? Oh, I'm hungry, I'm a bit bored. So it's that focus on self rather than on other.
Or even, by the way, not quite as kind of dismissive internally of the other person. It could be, that's a good idea. Oh, how could I do that? Or how could I use that? Or actually, I've got a slightly different spin on that. You know, so what you're doing is you're using the other person, what the other person is saying, as kind of fuel for you, rather than really listening, right?
Really sharing.
And that's only level 1.
Level 2 listening is where you really focus on the other person.
Right.
And so level 1 listening, you might be waiting for your turn to speak. Level 2 is a little bit like being really attentive, like a mother would be to a child, like you would be with a friend who's sharing something with you, or in a meeting where you're just riveted by what's being shared. So it's that real focus on other. And I suppose the space that we're suggesting people aspire to at least some of the time is that level 3, where it's that blend of self and other, and you're paying attention to the subtext, to the energy, to the tone of voice, and maybe to what's not being said, which I think ties back to your point about emotions. Like, maybe if there's no space to feel, well, how are they coming out in the organisation? How is it being expressed? You know, in your organisation, are the engagement statistics as poor as Gallup finds worldwide, where I think 13% of employees worldwide are engaged in their organisations? It's just a kind of ridiculously low number of people. So is there anything else you want to say about listening and then challenging conversations?
What you're reminding me of is when I first trained to be a psychotherapist, I did that in California, and the course was a brilliant course, and you started doing supervised practice straight away. And I worked with what we would call in the UK juvenile delinquents, right? So teenagers who'd gone off the rails. And the first patient I ever had was a 17-year-old boy who spent the entire session telling me in painstaking detail how he had taken a razor blade and peeled, scraped every bit of paint off his bike, right? And in those 50 minutes, that was literally all he talked about, right? And occasionally would say 1 or 2 other words or even a part of a sentence, right? And because as part of therapy, you're training to do that 3rd level of listening, when we finished and he left, I felt that I was exhausted. I felt as if I never listened more to anybody. And what had he been telling me, right, by doing this thing? And it was the moment that I realized that this is what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, right? And now I do it with kind of CEOs and business people, and they don't normally tell stories like that, but in another way they kind of do, right? So you're right, you know, that notion of really listening is absolutely crucial, right, to this notion of sharing that we're talking about in this chapter.
I suppose the metaphor is the iceberg, that you can pay attention to the bit above the water, or you can pay attention to the whole iceberg.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
And actually, level 3 listening is the iceberg and everything else, right? It's the seagull that just flew over and the thing over there that happened. And yeah, absolutely.
Listening's really crucial when it comes to challenging conversations, which I've mentioned a minute ago. And they connect back to this idea of sharing, being human at work. This idea of vulnerability isn't always just about saying, hey, I'm human and I've got a lot on and I can't get everything done that I said I would get done. It's also about taking risks, and that's one of the aspects of psychological safety is in a team where that's present, people will take risks and they will voice. So the example that's given is the nurse who sees a doctor misadministering medication. Will she speak up? Does she feel safe enough to do that? Or the air traffic controller who sees a colleague making a mistake where lives are at stake, literally moment to moment.
Well, there was a very famous study where a psychologist went into various hospitals and found a surgical team which had the absolute highest level of success, and she decided that she would try and find out what was it, right? And she looked at various things. It's not dissimilar to the Google psychological safety thing. And in the end, she had an absolute kind of eureka moment when she realised that actually that what was happening in that team was that nobody was admitting to any mistakes. They were actually one of the worst teams, right? But no, I mean, challenging conversations are really interesting, and I won't go into them in detail here. But I did use the idea of challenging conversations with Beata and her team, and you know, the way we do them is pretty challenging, right? But in the book, the point I make is that we could all have a challenging conversation, right? And it's just about communicating on a different level, right? And there's kind of 10 questions. I go first. You don't get to talk, right? I get to say my 10, and then you do the same. You say your 10 to me, and then we can talk, right? So each person says, what do I think we are really talking about? The real uncomfortable truth, not the surface version. Why do I think we haven't talked about this before? What am I feeling about this? What am I thinking about this? Potentially in that order, by the way. Why do I care about this? What will happen if I do nothing? What's my contribution to the way things are? What do I want to happen now? What will I do? And what am I asking you to do? And when I've given my answer to those questions, you give yours, and then together we talk about what do we commit to doing. Now, I've done this with, you know, really senior business teams, right? In several places around the world. I could also do it with my wife tonight over dinner, right? I can't actually do it with my 12-year-old daughter, right? I could do it with a friend, you know, we could do it if we had time, right? Check it out, and it's an amazing, powerful thing that can surface things. I used it with a team once of a big household name UK company, and it was 2 guys and a woman. They were the 3 leaders, if you like, and one of the guys had worked with the other guy like years ago in the same company, and then he got off to somewhere else and come back, and it turned out that they had an issue, and it went all the way back to something that had happened about a faulty thing. I won't say what it was because it might reveal 8 or 9 years ago, right? And they had a conversation when it came up. They had a conversation about that faulty thing, and one of them had a misapprehension about it. Quite a simple thing, right? And when they realised that, they first of all they started laughing, then they kind of stopped and actually started crying almost, right? And they hugged each other, and you were thinking like, guys, why have you not talked about that before? For 9 years, it has affected your relationships at work, and it's affecting this leadership team and the performance of this business at a national level, because you've never had a conversation where you were willing to say, actually, what am I really bothered about here and why? Right? It's extraordinary.
I think it's such an extraordinary example of why feelings are relevant in business.
That's right.
And the impact that it can have when we avoid them. And what I like about the chapter and what we've discussed today is that you're putting structure to it. Because I think the thing with feelings is they can feel quite frightening, quite overwhelming,
that's right.
that you might go there and it might just go on and on and on. And actually, there's a really structured way of dealing with it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Okay, thank you so much, Derek. I hope that's been as interesting for you as it has for me. I love talking about this stuff, could talk about it all day. To find out more, head over to derekdrapers.space and join us for the next episode.